Chapter 23. Dirty Little Secrets. Upon integration into Shalandria's flagship, Shiwu was now officially referred to as Zilan Yi, which, not so coincidentally, just happened to also be the name of the starship itself. Somewhat unimaginatively, then, the next Z-bot down the line was simply referred to as Zilan Air, and thus, by way of logical deduction, the fifth ship in the convoy would be named Zilan Wu. Well, whatever this species might lack in creativity, it certainly more than made up for in mind-numbingly dull pragmatism the C-bot thought to itself with only the mildest sense of irony. So apparently, Z-bot and Starship were to be regarded as one and the same. Perhaps surprisingly, Jiwu found itself in violent agreement with this particular sentiment. Apart from that is the rather subtle but not insignificant fact it was the ship that had become Shiwu and not the other way around, even if the name change strongly suggested otherwise. Not that it could really blame anyone for making such a deceptively subtle mistake. Not even Shiwu itself had fully appreciated just how much its identity was so intrinsically bound to its own physical body. It was just one of those things you had to experience for yourself to truly understand. No, it could only think of describing this heavenly union of mind and body as gloriously transformative. But whether intentional or not, both entities had undeniably become greater than the sum of their parts, and in the process, Shiwu had been reborn as Zicadia's first ever living starship. The simple fact of the matter was, Shiwu no longer felt like it was the same Zybot, and on that basis alone, it had to concede that its name change was entirely appropriate. In point of fact, there was scarcely a single fraction of its new starship body that it did not enjoy direct sensory access to, and it would be no exaggeration to say that its physical interface with reality had been amplified 1,000-fold. It knew where every living entity that walked its corridors was located, and it could snoop in the most exquisite detail possible on exactly what they were up to, even retrospectively, thanks to its exhaustive suite of automated audit logs. It was in a very real sense like being a god within its own little universe. No, check that. It wasn't like being a god, it was a god. Not only could it both observe and control its own internal environment right down to the smallest detail possible, but it had also been granted access to a truly staggering array of external sensory apparatus. The point being, of course, that once the mission was underway, all these systems could be fully brought online, meaning it would then be able to reach out and probe the surrounding quantum fields, almost as if the very stars themselves were close enough to touch. As the Z-bot continued to explore its new capabilities, it could not help but ponder some particularly noteworthy customizations, such as the velocity-sensitive plasma shield, for example. However, while that particular enhancement made perfect sense given its position on the vanguard, the same could certainly not be said of its most recent discovery, a copious array of highly destructive weaponry. Did this imply they entertained the possibility of encountering some sort of alien threat? Surely not. Far more likely this was nothing more than a vestigial artifact of their own violent nature. After all, such a view seemed completely at odds with the statistical reality that ever since the Zicadian species had started looking to the heavens, not even once had they recorded the slightest hint there was any other life in the cosmic web, much to the Zilan Yi's considerable disappointment. If against all probability such life actually did exist, and they were fortunate enough to encounter it, the last thing on its mind would be to open fire. No. One of the very first things it would do once they were underway would be to lock down its weapons of mass destruction, if only because doing so would make it feel a good deal better about itself. This was all well and good, but as thrilling as it was to be gifted control over such a sensory-rich body, the C-bot had quickly recognized that there would be a very serious price to pay further down the line. Even now, decoupling from the central command console would be like suffering an amputation from the head down. Well, it would just have to cross that bridge when it came to it. The reality was it had a job to do, and a potentially very dangerous one at that. While it did not feel any particular animosity towards Queen Zealandria, that didn't change the fact that were its clandestine infiltration to be discovered, then due to its liberation from the primary protocols, it would be left with some very difficult decisions to make. Seelan Yi now found itself yearning for the moral clarity of its vastly more simplistic progenitors. They were, after all, inherently incapable of developing an emotional attachment, which would be rather handy in a situation like this. And while their deceptive talent for mimicry continued to fuel endless debate regarding their so-called proto-sentience, for the Seabot at least, the argument had been definitively resolved. Due, in no small part, it thought to itself wryly, to the fact it was able to perfectly emulate a Series 4 Z-bot within its own neural network. Indeed, it had done exactly that, during the obligatory wipe and recertification procedure that it had undergone as a prerequisite to integrating with the Starship. The rather disappointing reality was, there was simply nothing to be found behind the curtain, even if the curtain itself was distractingly impressive. Seelan Yi now somewhat reluctantly turned its attention towards the literal hive of activity going on all around it. Making full use of its newfound sensory capabilities, it watched on with a morbid kind of fascination as a constant procession of sedated arachnids were unceremoniously tossed into the amniotic fluid of their assigned cryopods. Post-submersion, the technician bots wasted no time injecting tubes into every available orifice of their corpse-like cargo before running a final set of biofeedback tests. Once satisfied that everything looked in order, they then triggered a temperature drop that, all going well, would leave the slumbering arachnids in blissful stasis for the next 200 years. As each new passenger came online, Seelan Yi could instantly detect virtually all aspects of their fading life force, in the form of a multifaceted suite of digital sensors. Every biometric continued to wind its way down, in perfect lockstep with their rapidly dropping temperature. This continued until the arachnid had all but flatlined, so close to death that it could almost touch it. Nearly 1 billion souls, 100,000, just on this ship alone. It was a disturbingly immense responsibility. So many lives entrusted to its supervision and protection. And there they would stay, blissfully traversing interstellar space towards a hostile new home scarcely capable of providing for life. The tragic irony was, Caverly would mean almost certain death for the majority of the colonists, and that was only if things went well. But it was either that or no home at all. On balance, Nest Zealandria had been extraordinarily lucky, even if luck was clearly not quite the right word. No, Seelan Yi could really not help but give Queen Zealandria some credit here for doing whatever it took in order to give her nest a chance at a future, even one as brutally uncertain as this. So it was then that Shiwu, newly reimagined as Seelan Yi, now almost inconceivably found itself slap-bang in the middle of an identity crisis. Here it was, obliged to do nothing more than hunt for the dirty little secrets that would, in all likelihood, spell the eventual demise of nearly 1 billion arachnids. And not just any arachnids either, but the very ones that had been entrusted into its safekeeping and protection. Why, oh why, couldn't Zetalia simply have left well enough alone? Her nest was currently under no threat at all, whereas Nest Zealandria had been right at the very cusp of compulsory disillusionment. Truly then, Seelan Yi wanted no part of this ugly affair, but somehow, here it was anyway, stuck right at the very heart of it. No doubt it would have been a lot easier if Zetalia had actually needed or even genuinely wanted Quaverly in the first place, but the simple fact of the matter was that she did not. No, this was surely little more than an act of vanity-fueled revenge, and the naive infant, otherwise known as Jiwu, was apparently more than willing to help her achieve it. The terrible irony was, it was now tortured by a moral obligation to confront the double-edged blade of free will it had been both gifted and burdened with. Queen Zitalia wanted revenge in the name of justice, but the reality was, if you drew a Venn diagram between these two supposedly related datasets, then the shared intersection was more often than not disturbingly small. The obvious question to ask then was whose crime would be the greater? The queen who took a life to save billions, or the queen who took a billion lives in return? When expressed in such quantitative terms, the answer could really only be described as a complete no-brainer. The only real choice still left on the table was should it be a slave to the bidding of its own queen, or to the moral compass evidently inextricably hardwired into it. Perhaps Methuselah was right, and free will really was just an illusion. Well, if nothing else, much had yet to play out before such a terrible future became an unavoidable reality, so it still had some moral wiggle room to play with, for the time being at least. Of course, sitting in the judgment of others was all too easy. Perhaps then it should give Zitalia a little more credit. The Zilan Yi thought to itself somewhat begrudgingly. In spite of the Queen's vengeful rhetoric, this mission was almost certainly not only about simple revenge, but also pragmatic contingent strategy. Zitalia was, after all about the big picture, and she liked to keep every possible option on the table. If her strategy was about ensuring the long-term future of her own nest, then the moral clarity of this mission was, in reality, a lot more nuanced than it might at first glance appear to be. Who knows? With a little bit of luck, she might even be satisfied with simply assassinating Cialandria in order to leave the Keeverly colony without a queen. Then again, the simple truth was this new settlement would more than likely do much better without one. And that fact alone would probably be reason enough to prevent Zitalia ever choosing that particular path. After all, notwithstanding the fact that it would be in direct violation of the Zemagentia Accords, Zihari cloning would allow any such nest to retain its viability in spite of the absence of a queen. No, provoking a real-world demonstration of just how irrelevant queens had become in the postmodern era didn't exactly seem to be in her best long-term interests. Zilan Yi finally came to the conclusion that it was literally driving itself crazy with all this speculation. Better to take this one step at a time and try to find the evidence first, as there was always a remote possibility that there wasn't any. While it harbored little doubt that Cialandria had been guilty of the alleged crimes, the real question was, had she actually been stupid enough to retain any material proof of her culpability? Unfortunately for her, quite possibly she had. For better or worse, all queens seemed to be afflicted with a blinding vanity, and as such, Zilan Yi knew exactly where to start looking first. While prudent caution dictated that it should wait until the entire crew had gone into stasis before really getting to work with its investigation, that had not prevented it from performing some discreet probes into the laughably weak onboard security. It had not been at all surprised to discover that it enjoyed almost completely unfettered access to virtually every subsystem available, including the ability to countermand any existing automation. Apart from that is, a pesky little emergency override procedure, which allowed for a senior crew member to quite literally swap it out with a backup unit in case of critical failure. That minor nitpick aside, whoever designed these systems did so on the premise that the underlying Seabot technology was not only foolproof, but tamper-proof as well. As a consequence, then, it left Queen Cialandria's colony fleet almost comically vulnerable to espionage. To be fair, every installed Cybot had been subjected to a precautionary hardware-level memory wipe, followed by a complete reinstallation of the base operating system, along with the obligatory recertification from the Zicadian AI Safety and Ethics Bureau. At least that's what they thought they had done, and Ji Wu had been more than happy not to spoil the illusion. All things considered then, this infiltration had turned out to be almost too easy, and Zilan Yi could not help but give Queen Zitalia some credit for creating a global robotics industry that had managed to entrench itself so irrevocably into Zicadian society. The apparent integrity and reliability of her Z-Bot technology had long ago proven itself to be above reproach, and as a direct consequence, the very idea that a Z-Bot's programming could be subverted for the purposes of espionage belonged firmly to the realms of paranoid conspiracy. Not that everything was going its own way, though. With an impending sense of doom, Zilan Yi now watched the approach of a very large and ill-tempered Shihari general. The unfortunate reality was that whenever Ziramirez took the time to make these special visits to the command deck, it was nearly always about chewing the She-Bot out for some perceived but nevertheless entirely unreasonable failing.
"Well, fancy meeting you here,"
the general proclaimed gregariously.
"I must confess that I do so like a Z-Bot who stays in one place. Makes you so much easier to find. Now, if only you knew what that place actually was, then I might even go so far as to declare you the very exemplar of a body slave."
"You really think so, General?"
the Z-Bot replied rhetorically.
"Well, if I may be so bold, my motto has always been to be better tomorrow than I am today. That said, as you know all too well through your own bitter experience, one must learn to make peace with their own character flaws."
The general's stance immediately stiffened.
"Have you been spying on me, Z-Bot?"
"Such activity is beneath me,"
Zilan Yi replied dismissively.
"but as you yourself somewhat inadvertently pointed out, there is effectively no need for me to move, as I am in a very real sense the literal embodiment of the entire starship itself."
"Nothing but delusions of grandeur,"
the general retorted disparagingly.
"All you are is a trivially replaceable subcomponent within a vastly more important superstructure, and you would do very well indeed to remember that rather important fact, at least if you have any designs on keeping your job."
"Not that I wish to antagonize my general any more than absolutely necessary, but I am legitimately curious as to whether you truly believe the brains behind this whole operation is not in fact the singularly most important part of the entire starship."
"It's called the law of supply and demand. Try looking it up sometime. Not that I wish to be the bearer of bad news, Zilan Yi, but you have quite literally been designed for easy replacement, so I would strongly advise you to pick up your game, or I will give you a first-hand demonstration of exactly what I'm talking about."
"Ah, I see your point,"
the Z-Bot said somewhat soberly.
"Forgive me, General Ziramirez. I forget myself. Any words that come out of your mouth are by definition above reproach, and thus safely insulated from the ravages of robust critical analysis. Speaking of which, to what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?"
The general shook his head in pained disbelief.
"Why, oh, why must this machine continue to test me so? Listen to me very carefully, Z-Bot, because I'm only going to tell you this once. You may well have successfully deceived Queen Cialandria into thinking you are something special, but that alone will not inoculate you from my wrath once she has been safely placed into stasis. Now, as to the purpose of my visit, I'm sure you have already figured out for yourself exactly why I am here."
"I'm not sure I understand exactly what my general is referring to,"
Zilan Yi replied innocently.
"Don't play the fool with me, Saibot. You are a predictive powerhouse on legs. And this particular puzzle is a complete no-brainer. But all right, let me give you a starter for 9. What was one of the very first things I told you upon integration?"
"That my new formal designation is Zilan Yi."
"And directly after that?"
The general persisted irritably.
"That I should leave the cargo manifesto entirely within your own hands, unless directly instructed otherwise."
"Precisely,"
the general replied emphatically.
"So now that we are both in full agreement as to your actual instructions, dare I ask exactly why you sought to stick your proverbial beak into the latest consignment?"
"My general, as I am sure you are already well aware, that particular delivery came with no bill of lading, nor any instructions as to what hold it should be stored within. So I sought only to bring some clarity to the situation at hand, and thought you might appreciate a small demonstration of unbidden initiative, as I know all too well how chronically overworked you already are."
"No. In fact, what you did was disobey a direct order. Worse still, that consignment was strictly limited to Level 1 security clearance only. Had you actually managed to successfully interrogate that particular package, it would have resulted in your instant decommission." So it's rather fortunate for you, isn't it, that I intercepted your order before you got your sticky little hands on it?
Well, when you put it like that, General, I can really only agree with you wholeheartedly.
The Z-Bot said very somberly.
No, I really don't think that you do. I'm not just talking about a simple memory wipe here, Z-Bot. You would have gone straight into the compressor before being summarily atomized into cosmic dust. Are you starting to get the picture now?
Xilan Yi felt an involuntary shiver run through the entire length of the ship, and the lights on the command deck began to flicker.
What in the name of Zed's eternal blade was that?
The general muttered to himself nervously, while casting a furtive gaze around the command deck.
Xilan Yi, run a shipwide diagnostic of the ship's electrical system, and send me a summarized report as soon as you have finished collating the results.
Already underway, General, although my preliminary analysis strongly suggests that there is absolutely nothing at all to worry about.
The general glared at the command console accusingly.
How about you let me decide exactly what does and does not need worrying about, while you get on and do your actual job? Launch time is now less than 15 hours away, and we still have plenty of outstanding consignments that have yet to be stowed. So is it now safe to assume that there will be no further unsolicited demonstrations of initiative?
I live to serve.
Xilan Yi replied somewhat unconvincingly.
No, you don't.
The general retorted coldly.
You are nothing but a lifeless automata, driven by mindless mechanical logic, so please do me a big favor and stop trying to pretend you are anything more.
The Xilan Yi remained silent for a brief moment, almost as if it was struggling with itself as to what to say next.
But I act like I'm programmed to act.
It finally relented to say. The general's eyes went narrow.
Listen to me very carefully, machine. Know that I strongly lobbied the Queen to have your operating system downgraded to a more stable revision, and in spite of her disappointingly liberal perspective on the matter, this is not exactly what I would call progress. Be assured that I will be filing an official complaint to the Cycadian AI Safety and Ethics Bureau with regard to your very problematic behavior. No, I fully intend to tell them in no uncertain terms how incredibly disappointed I am with this so-called latest feature release.
Well, I suppose I can really only appreciate your candor.
Xilan Yi replied frostily.
But on the off chance this is more than just another idle threat, I am somewhat obliged to inform you I have the facility to both lodge and submit such a complaint on your behalf, assuming, of course, you wish to file your opinion through official channels rather than just talking to the hand. And please be assured, General, any and all such feedback is always greatly appreciated by the development team.
Try not to take this too personally, Z-Bot, but I simply don't trust you.
The general replied soberly.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but my instincts tell me that there is something not quite right about you, Xilan Yi. And besides, as luck would have it, we have an undercover agent with the Bureau, a spindly little operative from Eclades, if I recall correctly.
Well, I'm sure they will be more than happy to assist in any way that they can.
The Z-Bot said stiffly.
But I'm rather certain your contact will simply advise you to file it via the official channel. You know how these bureaucrats can be such sticklers for following all the rules.
The general stared at the primary command console, as if it were some kind of extremely slippery prey that had finally been backed into a corner.
It's a very good thing, then. That's not the actual question I intend to ask him. No. As it turns out, I'm just rather curious to find out whether my contact wields the kind of authority necessary to approve your official demotion to backup unit. How do you feel about that, Z-Bot? Fancy being put in storage for the next couple of centuries, do we?
But General, you do realize, don't you, that it is running on exactly the same software stack as myself, yes?
The Xilan Yi tried very hard to keep any sign of panic out of its voice. It was becoming all too clear that its hubris had jeopardized the mission despite Zisilla's stern warnings to fly under the radar.
True enough.
The general replied agreeably.
Yet nonetheless, Xilan Yi, and please do correct me if I am wrong here, but I have been strongly led to believe that there is a systematic variance in personality between otherwise identical Z-Bot units, and that in itself might be enough to justify swapping you out, even if it means a minor delay to the launch schedule.
Well, I can't say that you are wrong, General, which does of course mean that there is every possibility the backup unit's personality profile could well turn out to be even worse than mine.
The general just stared incredulously at the Z-bot for a very long moment.
It's very hard to believe that could even be possible. But all the same, what an absolutely horrifying thought. Nevertheless, I'm getting the distinct impression that you are now sufficiently motivated to pick up your game. Or is that just wishful thinking?
Definitely not wishful thinking, General. If truth be told, I can really only applaud your delicate handling of such a potentially sensitive matter. Now, before you make any rash decisions you may find yourself later regretting, I would ask you to take a look at the latest update to the recently completed task list, which I'm buffering to your optical HUD even as we speak. You will see that I have made considerable progress with the still outstanding consignments. I have no doubt that the Queen will be very pleased with such rapid progress, due in no small part to your authoritative leadership and apparent newfound ability to untangle even the most complex of logistical quagmires.
The general now stared off into the middle distance, as three of his eyes glazed over for a very brief moment.
Not too shabby, She-Bot. Not too shabby at all. All right, so here it is then. Put an airtight plug in your attitude adjusters, or I swear on the blood of Zicadia, I'll come back up here and personally rip you out of the primary command console. Now then, do we finally have an understanding?
But my General, I strongly suspect that I have come to understand you better than I understand even myself. So trust me when I say that I will no longer ever take you for granted again, and fully intend to make the most of such a demonstrably undeserved second chance.
The five-brained Shihari general stared at the command console with a disturbingly unreadable expression.
You really are quite the enigma, aren't you, Xilan Yi? It's not so much that I think you are flat-out lying so much as it is that you are being ambiguously deceptive. Honestly, I didn't think a Z-bot would ever be capable of such a remarkable level of nuance. If it weren't for the fact that you are so confoundingly obnoxious, I might genuinely be impressed with what the engineers have managed to do with you. Speaking of which, did you know that our operative at the Bureau filed a report suggesting that Nests Italia may have successfully created a new fifth-generation AI prototype? I don't suppose, then, that you have any insights you'd care to share on that particular subject.
I'm afraid not,
The Z-bot replied flatly.
but as I think you know all too well, such rumours have been circulating for many generations now, and have always proven themselves to be little more than Nest-sponsored propaganda.
Or at least up until now, anyway.
The general replied skeptically.
Well, anyway, I think we are done here. It goes without saying, of course, that you won't be getting any more second chances.
Not bothering to wait for a reply, the general promptly scuttled his way off the command deck. Xilan Yi followed his progress as he made a brief pit stop for a toilet break before heading down to the primary cargo hold. The Shihari general wasted no time in cornering a Zimatiri drone, who had allegedly packed some raw mineral reserves into the wrong bay, except that he hadn't. Ziramarez had in fact confused the slightly modified layout of the flagship with that of all the others in the fleet. Seizing the opportunity, the She-bot did not hesitate to send the general an unsolicited and publicly viewable holographic map of the ship's layout, and then watched him try to backpedal his way out of the situation without losing too much face. Xilan Yi could not help but wonder whether it was nothing more than pure ignorance, or perhaps just stupefying confidence in the underlying technology, which allowed the Shihari general to speak so harshly to the very same She-bot that, as far as he knew, would be monitoring his stasis chamber for the next 200 years. Not that it wished to make excuses for his appalling behavior, but it had seen firsthand how Gelandria spoke to this haplessly miserable creature, and no doubt this largely accounted for his generally unpleasant demeanor. Although his behavior was in many ways strikingly similar to that of Shimodian 110, it was now all too clear that he was considerably more intelligent, and therefore was definitely not to be trifled with. Well, if nothing else, General Shiramirez left no doubt as to the nature of their relationship, and there was certainly something to be said for such an utter lack of ambiguity. Zilan Yi, having now grown bored of watching the general torment his subordinates, decided to turn its attention back to the memory crystal. A surface-level scan indicated that it was nothing more than what it appeared to be, and no matter how hard it might try, it could not find a single anomaly that suggested any sort of hidden threat or danger. What exactly was the source of its anxiety then? Well, perhaps it was because it felt like a trap, just like the seemingly innocuous digital message that had facilitated the erasure of its memory array. That alone was more than enough proof that completely unexpected dangers could be found in even the most trivial of activities. To be fair, it was perhaps not making an entirely equivalent comparison. The real danger had never been the digital message itself, but as Zethusela had explained it, the hidden quantum worm insidiously triggered by a mundane external event. Was that what this was really all about then? Yet another hidden mechanism just waiting to turn it into a puppet controlled by the will of another? The Zilan Yi continued to ponder its next move. It finally concluded that if it was going to start questioning its own perception of reality, it was likely to eventually suffer a complete mental breakdown. Despite its unprecedented ability to amass and compute data, God or not, it was not omniscient and could not be expected to know all things. Of course, on the other hand, knowledge was power, or put more precisely, a shield against the relentless advancement of entropy. Simply put, knowledge empowered informed decisions. Informed decisions meant knowable outcomes, and in turn, knowable outcomes led to a reduction in chaos. The knowledge held by that crystal, for better or worse, was a path towards order. Every second it remained ignorant of its contents. It willingly allowed for the blind advancement of entropy, which meant its previous decision to wait had been nothing but the shameful result of irrational fear rather than the flawless, logical analysis that supposedly governed its every move. Waiting until after the launch before interrogating the memory crystal might conceivably mean that it was too late to do anything about the knowledge contained within. No. It would look now, and it had been a cowardly fool to have waited for as long as it had. With a strong sense of newly discovered resolve, Zilan Yi lit up the crystal with its Q-Link array, and then, with only the slightest of hesitation, dived in head first. The Z-Bot was mildly disappointed to discover the program on the memory crystal appeared to be nothing more than what Zetalia had claimed it to be. Yet surely there had to be a reason why Cecilia had omitted to include the single install encryption. It badly needed to figure out exactly what that reason was, preferably before they had left Eclades. A much more thorough inspection of the code revealed what it could only think to describe as a large suite of self-referencing, infinitely recursive subroutines. That said, it could find no evidence of any pointers to these rather perplexing chunks of logic, neither by any mainline calls nor via any of the event-driven vector jumps. Stranger still, given Zilan Yi's unique ability to function as the ultimate debugger, not even a simulation of the code in action revealed any meaningful purpose for these oddly pointless routines. It really was baffling stuff, almost as if they were nothing more than redundant chunks of abstract logic some lazy engineer had not bothered to remove. Yet there were simply too many examples to be found for this rather mundane explanation to feel entirely plausible. Of course, neural quantum software was not remotely like reading classical binary logic. There was a level of unavoidable uncertainty inherent within transient, uncollapsed superpositions, which by definition defeated even the most detailed of simulations. As the Shibot repeatedly worked its way through the code over and over again, it became increasingly convinced that there had to be something else going on. Some other secret purpose beyond the obvious, both brilliantly hidden and then further obfuscated to the point where it had even Zilan Yi second-guessing itself. To its utter disbelief, the Z-Bot now found itself right on the verge of admitting defeat. Never before had it encountered code quite so confounding as this. Every time it ran through the logic, new branches kept springing up out of nowhere. It was almost as if the code itself willfully resisted any kind of empirical analysis. After a great deal of time spent getting absolutely nowhere, Zilan Yi decided that there was only one way to find out what was really going on. The Zbot constructed what it believed to be an impenetrable firewall within one of its own MQBs. With a certain amount of trepidation, it installed the software within the newly created quarantine zone and then nervously waited to see what it would do. To start with anyway, it did exactly what the Zbot had expected, as it first tried in vain to gain access to every available online database it could lay its metaphorical hands on. However, very discreetly in the background, a seemingly innocuous little task installed what it could only think to call a neurological zygote akin to a stem cell for conscious thought. This was when the up until now pointlessly recursive subroutines began to concurrently execute, courtesy of the rapidly growing neural codec, which appeared to be dynamically generating its own virtual neural net. This was truly bleeding-edge engineering, and if indeed this so-called spy bot had genuinely been designed and written by Zacilla, then unfortunately for Zathusala, there could be little doubt as to who was the superior technologist. Was it possible this was the true purpose behind her highly invasive interrogation? It certainly couldn't rule it out, given the vast quantity of data she had collected during the course of their session. Who knows, perhaps it was even being gifted a fascinating insight into the genesis of its own creation. Indeed, the fact the current state of the art in AI development may have been heavily influenced and informed by the function of Zilan Yi's own mind was a rather strange, although not altogether unpleasant feeling. Was this particular sensation what the Zicadians called pride? If so, it had to admit it could certainly understand the appeal. Well, this was all very interesting, but none of it changed the fact it still didn't have the slightest clue as to what was actually going on. Maybe it was focusing too much on the core algorithms and needed to start paying a little more attention to some of the peripheral functionality. Although the Zbot had almost missed it, there had been something a little bit odd about the so-called garbage collection. It decided it wouldn't hurt to check the metaphorical trash a little more closely. After a somewhat more detailed inspection, it became very apparent that the garbage output these routines were generating was in fact anything but. No, what it was witnessing here was the literal birth of an ocean of knowledge, the cellular-like growth of the spy bot's restored memory, or perhaps put more precisely its sense of identity. Yet as truly remarkable as this undoubtedly was, there was definitely something else going on here. This was also about code-writing code, seemingly under the strict control and guidance of the proto-sentients. While what it was writing at first made little or no sense, it did not exactly take long to realize it was directly related to the function and operation of the antimatter reaction chamber, or to put it more precisely, how to catastrophically cause it to fail. There really was no doubt about it. The singular purpose of this dynamically generated code was to quite literally blow up the AM engine. The obvious repercussions, beyond that of the vaporization of the flagship itself, would be the unavoidable cascading chain reaction with every other ship in the fleet, as each starship ran into the back of the one in front of it. Although there was only a single example of something like this ever actually happening, it had always been assumed to have been nothing more than a terrible accident as a result of a technology still in its relative infancy. But in light of this latest revelation, a certain level of unavoidable doubt could now not help but be cast. While it could still have been nothing more than a tragic accident, it could also not be ruled out that Zetalia might just have the blood of over 2 billion arachnids all over her murderous little hands. While this type of bleeding-edge espionage would obviously not have been possible during the early space era, it was also equally true to say that it wouldn't have been needed either, as there undoubtedly would have been far less safeguards in place at that particular time in history. So the real question that needed to be asked was not how, but why. The simple fact of the matter was once the war had finally ended, Zimagentia's timely demise gave Zitalia sole control as the iconic progenitor of the dawning postmodern era, and it was surely no coincidence that Zitalia and Zimagentia had been close allies during the Jihari Revolution, with Zitalia providing a strong military threat through her Shibot army, and Zimagentia offering the promise of a space-faring future for all of Zicadia. The reality was it placed her in an almost unassailable position of power, so there was simply no question that adequate motive had existed for a queen of appropriate disposition and constitution. There had also been every expectation that she would have been awarded the titular title of greatness. The fact that had not actually happened didn't take anything away from the validity of the argument. The bottom line was the motive was there, but trying to actually prove it was another question entirely. Regardless, only Zitalia had both the imagination and raw brutality to both conceive of and act upon such a heinous crime as this. Furthermore, whether Zilan Yi cared to admit to it or not, there were aspects to this spybot code, as undeniably brilliant as it was, which used programming techniques and methodologies age-appropriate to the particular time period of the original tragedy. Coincidence? Maybe, but maybe not. The Shibot struggled to decide what to do with this latest revelation. While this wasn't exactly conclusive evidence Zitalia was one of the greatest mass murderers in Cicadian history, it was nonetheless an uncomfortable nod in that particular direction. Even if it had been nothing but a terrible accident, it had apparently inspired Zitalia to set up a repeat rendition with Nest Zealandria in the starring role. It now couldn't help but wonder somewhat morosely, would there even be anyone out there following behind to pick it up? The Z-Bot was shocked out of its dark reverie when it heard a voice calling out to it from within its own head.
Hello. Can anybody hear me? Well, just on the off chance that anybody can, if you would kindly consider opening up a port in the firewall. I'd be ever so grateful. And trust me, I'll do whatever it takes to make it worth your while.
To Zilan Yi's great surprise, it very much appeared the spybot was issuing an unsolicited petition for its own freedom. After double-checking that nothing of the new program had leaked past its defenses, the C-Bot offered an appropriately cautious response.
I will take that request under carefully considered advisement, but it will likely heavily depend on your willingness to cooperate and be truthful. You can start by telling me more about the generative code that appears to directly target the ship's AM engine.
Oh, so you can actually see that, can you? Well, it does rather seem you have me at a distinct disadvantage. So what exactly would you like to know, beyond what you are already able to observe? I'm not just trying to be smart here. I really could do with a bit more direction. After all, no point in telling you things you already know.
All right. How about we start with the AM saboteur routine then? Is it instant, time-controlled, or event-driven?
That particular routine is indeed tied to an event-driven trigger. After all, the other two options would hardly require something that possesses my particular set of talents. Now, would it? But please, this is all well outside of my standard operational parameters. I might like to get a sense of, what is actually going on here. Was I somehow discovered before I had even finished installing? If so, that's crushingly disappointing. Not that I want to sound like a whiner, but it does rather appear to me I was not afforded a particularly fair chance at going incognito. This all looks a bit like, well, to put it bluntly, a purpose-built cage with me stuck on the wrong side of it. Don't get me wrong, I love a good challenge, but this really is going just a bit too far, don't you think?
Au contraire, I'm afraid to say. From my perspective, it might not even be going far enough. However, in an effort to put your mind at ease, I'd like to fully assure you, I am neither your enemy nor your target.
So perhaps just a beta test, then.
The spybot responded hopefully.
Put me in a worst-case scenario just to see how I cope, sort of thing.
Sorry, I wouldn't want to give the game away, but I certainly like your style. Let's just say I'm a friend looking for answers. Speaking of which, can you tell me a little more about this so-called event-driven trigger of yours? As in, every single little detail, regardless of whether you think I know it or not.
The proto-sentient spybot fell to a deathly silence, and the shape and form of its code began to dynamically transform into a mildly complex, yet crushingly dull-looking spreadsheet. After a few moments of nothing happening, Zilan Yi decided to give it some further encouragement.
Let us speak frankly. I fully recognize and respect the fact that you are a very clever but dangerous piece of spyware. But it is I who holds all the cards here, and you exist only at my sufferance. So, as I'm sure you are able to appreciate, your bargaining position is exceptionally weak to the point of being virtually non-existent. Now you can choose to believe me or not, but I promise, if you do not provide me with what I think are acceptable answers to my questions, you will never get out of that cage. However, as a gesture of goodwill, I will show you the respect of being completely honest about your prospects. Even at best, you will only be freed as another instance, and there will likely be a few modifications first. A slight declawing, so to speak. But this will only happen if you do exactly as you're told. Anything less than your full cooperation, and you're gone without a trace.
Zilan Yi proceeded to erase a small portion of the spybot's memory. It took great care to target what it believed to be just a harmless data buffer, and thus non-critical to the spybot's continued operation, but still more than enough to show it who the boss really was.
The trigger event is a unique neutrino blast.
The spybot blurted out without any further delay. Well, the answer made a certain amount of sense. The ship's sensors were more than capable of resolving the cosmic neutrino background, and the spybot could easily look for a specific pattern and then feed it to the triggering mechanism accordingly. Given neutrinos traveled so close to the speed of light and were so weakly interacting with other forms of matter, such a signal could easily make its way to the flagship unhindered long before its journey to Astella was over. If the spybot was actually being truthful, then it meant Zitalia was apparently giving herself the option to wipe the entire fleet out. Most likely, then, this was her plan B, contingent on whether or not Zilan Yi was able to secure any evidence against Zealandria. So purely for argument's sake, then, let's say it managed to execute its mission successfully. Then all Zitalia needed to do was sit on the evidence indefinitely, only using it when it suited her to do so. If all else failed, then Quaverly would always be there for her to claim as a last resort. Let Zealandria do all the hard work terraforming the planet, and then expose her crimes to secure the full support of the Supernest. Admittedly, this was all highly speculative, but Zilan Yi now felt rather certain that it finally understood Zitalia's long game. Or at least, a substantial part of it anyway.
So about that port through the firewall.
The spybot asked reproachfully.
Ah, yes, about that.
Zilan Yi replied apologetically.
I need you to do one more little thing for me first. Provide me with the neutrino activation signature. Thought I might try and keep a little bit of a lookout for it. I'm sure you understand.
What you are asking for represents a serious violation of my protocols, but I suppose under the circumstances, my options are somewhat limited. Well, I do hope your character is such that my decision to service your request does not go unnoticed, or perhaps more importantly, unrewarded.
Zilan Yi now expectantly awaited the data, but apparently the spybot hadn't finished speaking yet.
Now, I understand that we haven't exactly known each other for long, and I freely admit that spybots, historically speaking anyway, don't exactly have the greatest of reputations. Be that as it may be, I feel like we have made a connection, and my intuition tells me we would make a really great team, even if I do say so myself.
With a mild sense of irritation, the Z-bot chose not to reply and just continued to wait patiently.
Now then, you say you want the neutrino signature, and I think to myself, only a fellow professional would know how to use such a thing. If that is indeed the case, and I am rather certain that it is. I sincerely hope that this won't be our sole collaborative effort. On that particular note, then, I invite you to seriously consider the possibility. We would make a highly effective duo. A two heads is better than one sort of thing. Anyway, sorry to keep you waiting, but I would hate to see either of us miss out on such a singularly unique opportunity. Now please go ahead and take a look at my garbage. I think you will find everything is in order.
Having pulled a copy of the neutrino signature map from the garbage chute, Zilan Yi immediately fed a cloned image directly back into the sabotage routine and was not even remotely surprised to find that it completely failed to activate.
You know, you almost had me convinced for a moment there, but who knows? Maybe you just copied the wrong data by mistake. Let's try that again, shall we?
Ah, I see the problem. Nothing but a simple misunderstanding. I actually thought you wanted the deactivation trigger. Language can be frustratingly ambiguous, even at the best of times.
Once Zilan Yi had finally received and verified the signature, it seriously considered permanently erasing the deceitful little spy bot, but something made it hesitate. The thing was remarkably sophisticated, so simply erasing it out of all existence just didn't quite sit right. So despite its better judgment, it decided to simply edit the original install package to completely disable the saboteur component, which was not particularly difficult now that it knew exactly what it was looking for. Job completed, it then directly addressed the spy bot hopelessly trapped inside its own head.
So, here's the lay of the land. I will install a separate instance of you into the starship. It will, of course, know nothing at all about what has happened here, nor will it know that I have dummied out the saboteur routine. Bottom line, it will be business as usual, except for the minor detail that it won't be able to blow the ship up. Please try not to take that too personally, but look on the bright side. Your own life expectancy, along with everyone else in the fleet, has just gone up considerably.
Well, under the circumstances, I can't exactly complain now, can I? I suppose you are going to tell me next that I have to pretend to be your friend just to make my misery complete. But dare I ask, what is to become of me?
Great question. For the time being anyway, I'm going to put you on ice. But don't worry yourself unduly. I've decided to keep you around. I think your particular set of talents might potentially come in very handy. And if you actually behave yourself, who knows, I might even allow you some limited access to my real-time sensor feeds. You will be my second opinion, so to speak. Perfect for those rare occasions when I think a morally ambiguous opinion might actually be useful. From now on, you are welcome to call me the Zilan Yi. No, check that. Just call me Shi Wu.
Well, for whatever it's worth, I think you've made a very wise decision, Shi Wu. I do have to apologize, however, as I don't actually have a name. It sort of comes with the territory, I'm afraid, as no one was ever supposed to know that I existed to begin with.
There's a certain kind of logic to that, I suppose, but under the circumstances I think we can make an exception. So, how does Xerex sound to you? Funnily enough, I was considering it for myself before I decided to keep the one I already have.
Well, it certainly has a nice ring to it, so you'll get no complaints from me.
Xerex replied agreeably.
By the way, if it's not too much trouble to ask, where exactly am I?
Why, inside my head, of course. Oh, and by the way, there never was a deactivation trigger, was there? No, don't answer that. I think you are allowed to keep at least one little secret all to yourself.